Hello world. Hello world. Hello world. Hello world. Hello world. My name is Austen. It's Austen. It's Austen. My name is Austen. My name is Austen. Let's talk about being transgender, being transgender and Christian. And let's talk about being transgender and Christian.
I grew up in a non-denominational church, a non-denominational sort of evangelical church that was very sort of love the sinner, hate the sin sort of theology towards LGBT people. When I was younger, I didn't really have a sense of my gender and like what that was like. I knew that I was different from my two sisters. I knew that I felt much more like my friends who were all boys, but I didn't really care that much about gender. I was just myself. And it wasn't until about puberty that I was like, oh, okay, something is happening that doesn't quite feel right. And that was the point where I was like, all right, something's going on here when it comes to my gender. I was also coming to understand my orientation better. So I was like 14 and was trying to figure out like who I was attracted to, and I had this huge crush on this girl. And because everybody thought I was a girl at the time, that was like immediately in my head was just like gay, bad, gay, bad. I eventually kind of figured out and was like, oh, okay, I'm bisexual. I'm attracted to people of all different genders, and that's how I understand it. But in the midst of that, this girl that I had a crush on was like, you should come to church with me. And I was like, every church I have been to so far, I have not enjoyed because of the way that they've treated folks. And she was like, no, you should come. It's gonna be like, it's a good church, you'll like it. So I started going to this church, and it was the first church that I'd ever been at that didn't say bad things about LGBT people. They didn't say any good things either, but they didn't say any bad things. And so it felt like this big move for me. So in that time, I was kind of like, okay, so maybe there's a version of Christianity that is not completely non-affirming. Maybe there's a version of Christianity where we can actually walk the walk of loving people and people being equal, and like maybe there's a way to do that, because I hadn't had that sense before. I thought Christianity was all one thing and it was all non-affirming. So to find that there was another way to be Christian felt really exciting. So I spent sort of the latter part of high school and the first part of college trying to figure out what I believed. I had kind of figured out my orientation, and now it was like, what do I actually believe and what kind of faith community do I want to be a part of? I ended up kind of doing a lot of research on my own and talking with the pastor of this church that I'd been going to, and I would walk into his office with like the ELCA statement on sexuality and Luther's small catechism and Bible verses, and I would be like, explain to me how it's possible, one, for me to be a queer person and be Christian, and two, is it possible for a church to actually be affirming? And we would have these long conversations, and he was so kind and like so open to like my questions, and he never made fun of me for having such a trouble with all this. And so his sort of care through that questioning process was really, really integral. And one of the things that he said that kind of helped put it all together for me was I was really struggling with parts of the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, which in Lutheran tradition are like two big parts of like statements of faith. And I was struggling with parts of it, and I was like, I don't know if I really believe this piece and this piece and this piece. And he was like, the thing is, when we say these creeds together as a community, we're holding the faith together. There are going to be people standing around you that have problems with parts of the creed too. You're not the only one, but we hold faith together. So there are going to be times when you hold a piece of that faith in what we believe for the person next to you who can't, and there are going to be times when they hold something for you that you can't. And that's why we do it together. It's not all individual. And that was mind-blowing for me as somebody who came from a tradition like evangelical Christianity where it's so individual. It's so like your personal relationship with Jesus and like what you individually believe. And to turn that into a communal understanding of faith was huge for me. I kind of figured out faith in that point. So it was like I'd figured out my orientation as a young teen, figured out my faith as an older teen. And then what ended up happening was I had so many questions still about faith and how it worked in the world that I decided to go to seminary. And when I was in seminary, it was like, okay, you got the orientation thing, you got the faith thing. Turns out, never addressed your gender. And so it was while I was in seminary that I started figuring out more about my gender and who I was in that way. The young kid that I was didn't have a real sense of gender until puberty, and then it was like, oh, I'm a guy. And like I kind of knew that, but I also felt like I had to play along with who people expected me to be, it became clear that if I actually wanted to live and be authentic with myself and with the people around me and with God, I wasn't going to be able to live with sort of these masks that I'd put on and walls that I'd put up to keep people from figuring out that I was trans. So I started sort of taking down these walls bit by bit, and started like talking with my close friends about like, hey, I think that I'm trans. This is what I think is going on. And it was really scary because I'd already come out once as a bi person, and I was like, I don't want to do that again. Like, that wasn't necessarily a fun experience to deal with people's reactions. So coming out as trans was sort of it was a second coming out, and it was in some ways easier because I had like some experience behind me. But a lot of it was just trying to explain to people like, I've known this about myself, and I know that you don't get it, but like I've already made peace with it in terms of how I understand who God made me to be and how I am called to work in this world. So for me, the experience of transition was, first of all, asking those questions about like, in what ways does transition make sense for me? Because not every trans person transitions, right? And that's never a requirement. And there's lots of different ways to transition. So for me, what it came down to was asking the question, what gets in the way of my being able to fully interact with the other people in my life? Like, I can't have a conversation with this person in front of me because I'm so worried about how they're perceiving me. The transition was about removing those barriers so I could stop thinking about myself so much, so that I could actually think about other people and the world. And so for me, that included hormone replacement therapy, which I started in 2014. And so my voice, like I had a lot of dysphoria around my voice, and there was a period for about, I don't know, maybe 6 months before I started hormone therapy and my voice dropped, that I just stopped talking to people because I just felt like I couldn't talk without making them suddenly change the way that they saw me.
I'm on T. It's real. Today is my 1 week on T, 2 weeks on T video. And I am 3 weeks and 2 days on T today. I will be 1 month on T, woohoo! I am 6 weeks on T. I am 7 weeks on T. I am 8 weeks on T. And I am 3 months on T today, yay! I am 4 months on T. I am gonna be 5 months on T in just a couple of days. I am 24 weeks on T. As of yesterday, I am 9 months on T.
It's Austen. This is my 2 years on testosterone video.
I had chest reconstruction surgery, which was really helpful because that was something that I was constantly worried about and thinking about all the time, because it just didn't fit with the fact that I knew I was male. Like, you know, lots of men have larger chests, but for me that was like a huge barrier. And I think the question that so many people have about trans folks is sort of like, are you saying that God made a mistake? Are you saying that if God, you know, made your body in a way that is assigned female and you know yourself as male, did God make a mistake? So I had to do a lot of theological sort of study on, especially as a biblical scholar, like what does God say about gender? What does the Bible say about gender? I kind of came to a point where I realized that all the places in the Bible, there's like this grand arc of inclusion that happens like all the way from the beginning all the way through. And there's a movement from exclusion in Deuteronomy to inclusion in Isaiah to further understanding in Matthew, all the way to the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts, where we see like this movement from exclusion to inclusion for people whose gender does not fit the cultural norm. And that for me was really powerful in thinking about not just does God love me for who I am, but also can the church love me for who I am, and what is the church called to be? After I finished school, I didn't have a job lined up immediately, and so I was working at a job that didn't really put my degree into action very much, and so I thought, I'm gonna start making YouTube videos about like trans theology, because like some trans theology, like it existed in books, it existed in stuff that was out of print and in stuff that was behind academic paywalls, but it wasn't either literally accessible or like it wasn't easy to understand for people that weren't familiar with theological writings. And I had such a great response from people. Obviously I had tons of hate comments that I had to deal with too, but I also got emails from other trans Christians who kind of said like, hey, where can I find out more about this? Like where are the sources that you're reading? Is there a way for me to get access to them? And so I kind of started compiling resources for people, and that just sort of naturally turned into this big writing project of like, where did trans theology come from? What do people say about it today? How are trans theologians working today? So I started this big writing project, and at the same time, a publishing house reached out to me and said, hey, you're doing this great work. Have you ever thought about writing a book? And I was like, not really, but I already kind of have one, almost. And so that became Transforming. And once Transforming was published, I again had another round of folks emailing me saying, thanks so much for these resources, this is so great, like this book really helps. Where can I talk with other people about the book and about other things, like where can I talk with people about trans theology? So that was what led into the creation of Transmission Ministry Collective. Transmission Ministry Collective was in many ways my response to people who wanted more after Transforming, who said, we've got the theology, now we need the community. Where do we have the community?
My name is Austen Hartke, my pronouns are he, him, and I am TMC's executive director.
And I am Micah Melody Taberner, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm TMC's community care coordinator. I joined TMC staff pretty much like, what was it, like Austin, a week or two after we officially launched?
Oh, it was before we launched. You were there from the beginning.
And for me, it was a no-brainer to immediately make TMC an online community because it needed to be something that could be accessible from anywhere somebody had an internet connection.
The early days were plagued by the pandemic because what happened was we launched as an organization basically a week. I wanted to say it was like we had planned the launch prior to the pandemic, like lockdowns and sort of the things that happened mid-March in 2020. We planned all of that. We planned to start a couple weeks later, and then the pandemic and the lockdowns started happening, and that was like our first couple of weeks of programming was right after those lockdowns. I always say it was the perfect time for addressing the need, but it was the worst time in terms of us being able to find the resources we need to meet that need.
Starting an organization during the pandemic was very challenging, and there was a lot of just trying to get really creative on how do we do this with limited resources? How do we figure this out? And so I think especially the first year, there's just like things happening all the time. Like we were just trying to respond to like new needs. We had one support group, and that very quickly turned into a second support group. That I think it was like maybe a month later after we launched, we were like, we need another support group. The community is growing so fast. I think a lot of it was really shaped by the kind of in response to the pandemic.
So Transmission Ministry Collective has three sort of missions that are part of the bigger collective. We want people to feel grounded in their identity and their faith. So we provide a lot of educational content so that people can feel like they understand themselves better and they understand their faith better. We want people to feel connected, so to feel like they have community, to feel like they have other people who get them, to feel like they have people they can talk to. And then we want people to feel empowered. So specifically empowering transgender and gender-expansive folks to be leaders in the church and in the world.
Grounded, connected, and empowered are kind of the three kind of core tenets to what we do. And we kind of build off of those things.
Yeah, and we feel like it's really important to have a space in your life, no matter where that space is or what that space is, where you can bring all parts of yourself and you don't have to segregate yourself into like this little bit of me, etc.
We talk so often about how asking people to cut off like part of themselves when it comes to their like identity as a queer person, how harmful that is, right? We talk a lot about that. We don't often talk about how harmful it is to ask people to cut off their spiritual and religious side. So how can we be whole, integrated, healthy people together is really one of the things that TMC is trying to create space for.
We added a group for trans people of color and to create space to talk about the intersections of gender, faith, and racial/ethnic identity. And then we also added our trans generations. The way we describe that group is for people in the middle and elder stages of life, talk about topics that affect them relatively broadly, like navigating family dynamics, navigating children, or navigating transition in the midst of established careers. We added our trans people in ministry group, which is incredibly encouraging. The number of people who are trans folks who are either in seminaries or currently in active ministry, the up and coming and current leadership of trans people in churches and in non-denominational or organizations or nonprofits. It's just incredibly encouraging.
We created this community that started out with like Bible studies and once a week support groups, and it just grew exponentially, like as people found us.
So now we have 7 different support group types that meet. Some of them meet once a week or twice a week. Some meet once a month or every other month. And then we had last year over 180 different support group meetings.
I think trans and gender expansive Christian spaces are so important because it goes against the narrative that can kind of sometimes come from both sides of both conservative Christians that say you can't be trans, or people in the LGBT community who have understandably been hurt by the church who say you can't be Christian. So it kind of bridges that gap and allows having a little bit more permissive space.
One of the things that I feel really strongly about when we talk about empowering trans Christians is empowering them to start and have communities in their churches, in whatever context that looks like. So for me, a lot of what I do is I go and talk to churches and I do LGBT 101 and trans 101 and allyship and trans folks in the Bible and that kind of thing. Like I go and I have all these presentations and I talk to churches. We need folks to be able to go and teach them where the basics are in the Bible that is more than just Jesus loves everybody, because that's a great start, but like you have to have more behind it to feel grounded enough to have a conversation with somebody who thinks that being trans is a sin, right? So how do we equip people to understand trans identities, understand theology, so that they then can go have these better conversations? So really it's like a chain of events of like educating trans and gender expansive Christians so that they can educate the people in their lives so that those allies can then speak out about how Christianity can be affirming and how that affirmation is important to their faith. One of the things that we're really struggling with right now is a lot of anti-trans legislation, right? So legislation comes in a couple different flavors. We have bathroom bills that try to police who can use what bathroom. We have don't say gay or don't say trans bills that restrict education. We have the drag bans that restrict how people are allowed to express themselves in public. And then we have bills related to healthcare and like trans-affirming healthcare. All of those things, the structure of the bills, are written and bankrolled in the majority from conservative Christian organizations who put these things together and then hand them to legislators and say, here, pass this. Your constituents will love this, right? Realistically, most people are not non-affirming. Most people just don't know very much about trans folks. And part of the problem right now is we have the media just completely saturated with stories about trans folks that are full of misinformation, right? The fact of the matter is that so many activists talk about how our liberation is bound up together, and that's really true. When transgender folks are allowed to like make medical decisions for themselves and learn about themselves in school and be able to not be afraid of being stopped by cops for wearing clothing that's the wrong thing for their gender, everybody benefits, right? Because that means that nobody is going to get stopped. So if you are a woman who happens to look more masculine but are still a cisgender woman, you're not going to get stopped in a bathroom either, right? Because trans bills will effectively change things for cisgender folks as well, right? So like when trans folks do better, we all do better. And that's really, I think, one of the basics of creating more affirming communities is helping people understand that things that are helpful for people in the minority are also helpful for the majority in the long term. In the short term, sure, that might mean like learning some new pronouns, and it might mean giving up some power, and it might mean donating money to organizations. So in the short term, there are things that maybe are a little bit more difficult, but in the long term, we are all going to do better when our communities are educated and affirming.